didn't do anything. This is ridiculous.
Ma'am, I need you to calm down.
Calm down. You're not listening to me.
The majestic halls of the state Supreme Court are a sanctuary of polished marble and heavy silence, where the echoes of century-old laws dictate the rhythm of life for millions of citizens. Under the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, Justice Eleanor Hayes commands absolute respect with a single look, her black robe flowing behind her like a shadow of unquestionable authority. Here, power is measured in elegant fountain pens and leather-bound volumes that line the walls from floor to ceiling, creating a fortress of intellectual superiority and legal security. Outside, however, the city of 2026 breathes a different, more suffocating air, where the smell of damp asphalt and exhaust replaces the scent of old paper and prestige. In this temple of justice, Eleanor feels invincible, protected by the very institution she helped build through 4 decades of brilliant and tireless legal battles. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from. The transition from this world of privilege to the raw reality of the outskirts is a violent sensory shock that Eleanor rarely experiences in her elite routine. Tonight she drives the faded 1998 blue sedan that belonged to her late father, a humble relic that looks like a ghost in the modern, rain-battered streets of the forgotten neighborhoods. The worn upholstery of the vehicle and the slight metallic hum of the engine are the only links remaining to her past, an origin she spent years trying to refine and emotionally distance herself from. Beside her, 16-year-old Malik sits like a bundle of nerves, his eyes darting toward the shadows of the brick buildings that pass quickly by the window. He is a young man shaped by the harsh geometry of public housing, clutching a backpack overflowing with library books as if they were a shield. Suddenly, the oppressive darkness of the street is shattered by the rhythmic and aggressive pulse of red and blue lights reflected in the rearview mirrors and the cracked asphalt. The sharp electronic wail of a police siren cuts through the night air, demanding immediate submission from the old car that looks so out of place in this over-policed district. Eleanor feels a cold shiver of recognition, not of fear, but of a forgotten indignity that used to haunt her youth before she became an untouchable figure of power. She pulls the car over slowly, keeping her hands steady on the steering wheel, while Malik beside her begins to tremble visibly, his breathing becoming short and irregular. The flashing lights paint the interior of the sedan with chaotic strokes of emergency, creating an atmosphere of imminent confrontation that feels dangerously real and immediate under the cloudy night sky. Officer Klein, a rookie with a face hardened by a dangerous mixture of adrenaline and unearned arrogance, approaches the driver's window with a heavy hand on his holster. He does not see a Supreme Court justice. He sees only an old, cheap car and 2 faces that, in his limited worldview, represent a threat or an easy target. The beam of his flashlight cuts through the gloom, blinding Eleanor and illuminating the terrified expression of Malik, who remains fixed on the dashboard with a tragic, practiced resignation. The air inside the car becomes heavy with the metallic scent of fear and the smell of the officer's cheap cologne as he leans in, his shadow looming over them. Eleanor remains still, her analytical mind already recording every protocol violation, every aggressive posture, and every condescending look the officer casts over the modest interior of the vehicle. "Step out of the vehicle right now!" The officer barks, his voice carrying a superior authority that suggests he is dealing with unwanted subordinates rather than citizens. He ignores the standard procedure of requesting a license and registration, choosing instead to escalate the situation with a calculated aggressiveness, designed to humiliate and intimidate the occupants. Eleanor watches Malik's hands gripping the dashboard, his knuckles white as he tries to disappear inside his worn-out hoodie, a sight that pierces her professional armor. The officer leans in even further, his face inches from the glass, and sneers that he is going to teach them how the law works for people like them in this part of town. It is a moment of raw, unfiltered prejudice that strips Eleanor of all her titles and leaves her on the same ground she believed she had left behind. As Eleanor unbuckles her seatbelt, she looks Malik directly in the eyes, seeing the deep, cynical pain of a child who expects nothing but cruelty from the world. She realizes with a crushing weight that her brilliant decisions and bound opinions have failed to reach the very streets that birthed her original ambition and sense of justice. The rookie officer gestures impatiently for her to move, waving his hand in a dismissive way as if she were an insignificant obstacle to be cleared from the path. With a calmness that is more terrifying than any scream of anger, Eleanor steps out into the cold night air, her posture straightening despite the officer's attempts to shove her toward the rear. "I am going to show you exactly how the law is supposed to work," she whispers to herself, a promise that ignites a fire in her eyes. Eleanor stood on the cold sidewalk, the wind biting through her expensive silk blouse. She looked at the rusted gate of a nearby tenement, a place that mirrored the one she grew up in 45 years ago. Back then, the law was a shadow that loomed over her family, a set of rules designed to keep them small. She had fought every day to escape this grime, trading the scent of rain on hot asphalt for the sterile air of high court chambers. Now, standing under the flickering streetlights, the smells of the neighborhood triggered a visceral memory of her mother's tired hands and her father's warnings. She had become one of the gatekeepers of the very system that once terrified her. Yet in this moment, the gold-embossed business card in her wallet felt like a useless piece of cardboard against the officer's cold, metallic badge. The blue sedan was more than just an old vehicle. It was a sanctuary of memory she had stubbornly refused to trade for a modern luxury SUV. Her father, a hard-working mechanic who believed in the ultimate fairness of the American dream, had bought it with 3 years of overtime pay. When he passed away a decade ago, Eleanor kept the car as a tether to her roots, though she rarely drove it outside her gated community in the affluent suburbs. Sitting in the driver's seat after the officer finally stalked back to his cruiser, she felt the familiar texture of the steering wheel cover. It reminded her of her father's calloused fingers and his unwavering belief that, if you worked hard and followed the rules, the law would protect you. Tonight, that belief felt like a cruel joke, a fairy tale told to children to keep them compliant. Malik's silence in the passenger seat was louder than any scream she had ever heard in a courtroom. His older brother, Andre, had been the star of the family until a biased arrest 2 years ago sent him into the depths of the state prison system. Eleanor knew the case. She had seen the statistics of young men like Andre being swallowed by mandatory minimums, but she had never seen the hollowed-out eyes of the younger brother left behind. Malik's backpack was filled with history books because he was searching for a version of the world where he actually belonged. He had watched his mother age 20 years in 2, exhausted by legal fees and the heartbreak of visiting a son behind glass. To Malik, the law wasn't a noble pursuit of truth. It was a hungry beast that consumed his loved ones without hesitation. As Eleanor pulled away from the curb, the citation the officer had shoved into her hand sat on the dashboard like an insult. The officer had written her up for a faulty taillight and failing to yield, even though both were demonstrably false. She looked at Malik, whose tears were finally tracing silent paths through the dust on his cheeks. He wasn't just crying because of the stop. He was crying because he had seen this movie before, and it always ended the same way. The engine of the old sedan groaned as they navigated the potholed streets, the suspension bouncing painfully. Eleanor felt a sharp pang of shame for her own comfort, for the $3 million home she was returning to, while this boy would go back to a cramped apartment where the heater barely worked during the winter months. "He didn't even care who you were," Malik whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and absolute defeat. "He saw the car. He saw us. And that was enough for him to decide we were nothing." The words hit Eleanor harder than any legal dissent she had ever received from her colleagues on the bench. She realized that in her climb to the top, she had built an emotional fortress of logic and precedent to avoid feeling this specific kind of helplessness. She had intellectualized civil rights while living in a world of private security and gala dinners. Malik's trembling hands, still resting on his knees, were a physical manifestation of the trauma she had long since categorized as a systemic issue rather than a human tragedy happening right beside her in the night. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles ached, the leather-wrapped plastic creaking under her pressure. She had spent 20 years as a judge, priding herself on her objectivity and her ability to remain detached from the emotional chaos of the litigants. But tonight, that detachment felt like a betrayal of her own humanity and a failure of her public office. She thought of the thousands of cases she had presided over, the signatures she had scrawled on orders that changed lives forever. Had she been blind to the reality of how those orders were carried out on the street level? The flickering neon signs of liquor stores and laundromats blurred past, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of her neighborhood, highlighting the massive chasm between her life and Malik's. Malik turned to her, his gaze sharp with a cynicism that no 16-year-old should ever possess. "Why didn't you tell him?" he asked, referring to her position as a Supreme Court justice. "You could have ended it in a second, but you let him talk to you like that." Eleanor took a deep breath, the cool air from the vents smelling of old dust and rain. She explained that she wanted to see the officer's true character, without the shield of her title. She needed to know what happened to a regular citizen when no one was watching from a high bench. Malik laughed, a dry, hollow sound that lacked any real mirth. "Now you know," he said, looking out the window. "He would have taken us to jail if he felt like it, and nobody would have believed our side of the story." They arrived at the community center where Eleanor had originally met Malik for a mentorship program she had joined mostly for public relations purposes. The building was a beige brick box with barred windows, a place meant to foster hope that looked more like a holding cell. Eleanor realized that her presence here had been a performance of charity rather than a genuine commitment to change. She looked at Malik as he prepared to step out into the darkness, his backpack slung over one shoulder like a heavy burden. She wanted to tell him that everything would be okay, that the system worked, but the lie died in her throat. Instead, she reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I am not going to let this go, Malik," she promised, her voice regaining its judicial steel. The drive back to her own neighborhood was a journey through different centuries and different realities. As the broken pavement transitioned into smooth, silent asphalt and the streetlights became consistent and bright, Eleanor felt a rising sense of indignation. She passed through the security gates of her community, the guard nodding respectfully at the old sedan, only because he recognized the woman behind the wheel. Her house was a sprawling masterpiece of glass and steel, worth over $5 million, sitting on a hill overlooking the city. Inside, the rooms were filled with expensive art and rare books, but they felt colder than the interior of her father's car. She walked into her study, the silence of the mansion pressing against her ears, and sat at her mahogany desk, staring at the citation on the blotter. Sleep was an impossibility that night as Eleanor replayed the officer's sneering face in her mind. She thought about the internal affairs process she had often upheld in her rulings, the presumption of regularity given to police actions. It was a legal doctrine she had defended in countless opinions, but tonight it felt like a weapon used against the innocent. She looked at a photograph of herself in her judicial robes, standing next to the governor, and felt a wave of nausea. She had become part of the machinery that allowed a rookie officer to believe he could teach the law through intimidation and fear. Her wealth and status were supposed to be a reward for her service, but they now felt like a bribe that had kept her quiet and comfortable for far too long. The next morning, Eleanor entered the police station not as a judge, but as a complainant, wearing a simple trench coat and no jewelry. She wanted to experience the bureaucracy from the bottom up, to see the hurdles that Malik's family faced every day. The sergeant at the front desk was dismissive, barely looking up from his computer as he handed her a crumpled form. He told her that Officer Klein was a good kid, and that she probably just didn't understand the complexities of a high-crime area at night. Eleanor watched as other citizens were treated with similar indifference, their voices silenced by the weight of the institution. It took 3 hours just to get her statement recorded, a process designed to exhaust the willpower of anyone seeking accountability from the powerful. Within 48 hours, the retaliation began in a subtle bureaucratic way that Eleanor recognized instantly. Her office received a call from the city attorney's office, hinting that her complaint was causing unnecessary friction and might reflect poorly on her upcoming judicial review. They were trying to use her own career against her, assuming she would value her reputation over a minor incident on a dark street. The police department released a modified version of the dashcam footage, edited to make her appear non-compliant, and the officer appear professional. They didn't know that Eleanor had already secured the full, unedited video through a private contact in the city's digital archives. The corruption was deeper and more coordinated than she had imagined, a protective web spun to shield the smallest of their ranks. Eleanor met Malik a few days later at a local park, away from the prying eyes of the community center. He looked even more tired, his eyes shadowed by the weight of a world that refused to give him a break. He told her that he had seen a police cruiser parked outside his school, and the officers had stared him down as he walked to the bus. They were trying to intimidate the witness, to break the spirit of a 16-year-old boy to protect a rookie's ego. Malik's fear was a physical thing, a tremor in his hands that he couldn't hide no matter how hard he tried. "Please, Justice Hayes, just drop it," he pleaded, his voice small and defeated. "It's only going to get worse for me. They never lose, and we never win." The internal conflict tore at Eleanor as she looked at the boy's terrified face. Part of her, the pragmatic judge who understood the cost of a long legal battle, wanted to protect him by walking away. But the other part of her, the woman who had fought her way out of poverty, knew that walking away was a form of complicity. She realized that she had been living in a bubble of luxury that allowed her to ignore the screams of the city. She spent the afternoon walking through Malik's neighborhood, noticing the lack of grocery stores, the broken playgrounds, and the heavy presence of patrol cars on every corner. It was an environment designed for failure, a trap set by a society that preferred incarceration over investment in its own youth. Eleanor decided to take a radical step, one that would put her entire career and legacy on the line. She began drafting a formal lawsuit against the city, not just for the traffic stop, but for the pattern and practice of constitutional violations. She spent her nights researching the legal precedents she had once helped establish, looking for the cracks in the armor of qualified immunity. She worked in her father's old car, parked in the driveway of her mansion, finding more clarity in that cramped space than in her vast library. The contrast between her two worlds was now a source of strength rather than confusion. She was no longer just a judge sitting on a high bench. She was a witness to the failure of the law she loved. The pressure from the city attorney intensified, moving from subtle hints to overt threats of a public scandal. They suggested that her relationship with Malik could be misconstrued, a disgusting attempt to smear her character and silence her advocacy. Eleanor felt a cold, sharp anger that she had never experienced in a courtroom. She had seen this tactic used against the vulnerable for decades, a way to isolate them and make them feel ashamed of their own victimhood. She realized that her status and wealth gave her a unique weapon. She was the one person they couldn't easily crush. She had the resources to fight back, and for the first time in her life, she felt that her money and power had a true, moral purpose beyond her own comfort. Eleanor invited Malik to her home for a study session, wanting him to see the world he was fighting for. As he sat in her grand library, surrounded by the wisdom of centuries, his cynicism began to melt away just a little bit. She showed him the Constitution, not as a static document, but as a living promise that required constant defense. They talked about the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, concepts that Malik had only known as abstract theories in his schoolbooks. Seeing him engage with the law in such a setting was a transformative experience for Eleanor. She realized that the law was only as strong as the people willing to stand up for it, regardless of the personal cost or the height of the opposition. As the date for the deposition approached, the city's legal team grew more arrogant, confident that they could bully a retired-age woman into a quiet settlement. They filed motions to dismiss, citing the officers' good faith and the inherent danger of the neighborhood. They didn't realize that Eleanor was building a case that would expose the rot at the very heart of their department. She spent her time gathering statements from other residents who had been harassed by Officer Klein, building a narrative of systemic abuse that could not be ignored. She was no longer acting as a distant arbiter of justice. She was a warrior for it, her judicial temperament tempered by a fierce, maternal need to protect Malik and others like him. On the eve of the deposition, Eleanor sat with Malik one last time. He was nervous, his leg bouncing as they sat in the quiet of the library. She told him that tomorrow would be difficult, that they would try to make him feel small and irrelevant. But she also told him that he carried the truth, and the truth was the only thing that could ever truly set them free. She felt a profound bond with this boy, a connection that transcended their different backgrounds and ages. They were both victims of a system that had forgotten its soul, and together they were going to demand it back. As the moon rose over the city, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, ready to step back into the arena. The conference room at City Hall was an arena of dark oak and expensive leather, designed to intimidate the common citizen into submission. Across the long table sat the city attorney, smirking behind a mountain of legal briefs. flanked by the police chief and a defiant Officer Klein, who still wore his uniform like a suit of armor. They spoke in hushed, condescending tones, laughing about the old lady who thought she could challenge the department's absolute authority with a simple complaint. Malik sat in a corner chair, his head bowed, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole, as the city attorney joked about the cost of impound fees for such an old car. The air was thick with the smug confidence of men who believed they were the law, untouchable in their ivory tower of municipal bureaucracy, completely unaware that the storm was already at their doorstep, waiting to break. The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open with a resounding thud that silenced the room instantly and froze the laughter in their throats. Eleanor Hayes did not enter wearing the modest trench coat or the civilian clothes they had seen in the dashcam footage. She entered in the full, sweeping majesty of her black judicial robes. The silk fabric rustled with every purposeful step she took toward the head of the table, her presence filling the room with a weight that made the air feel thin. The city attorney's smirk vanished so quickly it looked like a physical injury, his face draining of color as he scrambled to his feet in a reflexive display of court-mandated respect. Malik looked up, his eyes widening with shock as he saw the woman who had shared a quiet car with him transformed into a living symbol of the state's highest power. "Let the record show," Eleanor began, her voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and commanded total, unwavering attention. "That Justice Eleanor Hayes is now presiding over this informal inquiry into the conduct and the systemic failures of the city police department." The city attorney tried to stammer out a protest, his voice cracking like dry parchment, but she silenced him with a sharp raise of her hand that carried more weight than a physical blow. She didn't need a gavel to command the room. Her gaze was a scalpel, peeling away the layers of their arrogance until only their raw fear remained. She placed a stack of documents on the table, the unedited dashcam footage and her own sworn testimony, and leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Officer Klein, who was now sweating profusely through his starched blue uniform, his previous bravado having completely evaporated. She spent the next 20 minutes conducting a masterclass in constitutional law, dissecting Officer Klein's actions with a precision that was both terrifying and breathtaking to behold for everyone present. She quoted the Fourth Amendment not as a dry text, but as a sacred barrier that he had trampled upon with his muddy boots and his unearned sense of superiority. She pointed out every lie in the falsified police report, matching them second by second against the unedited footage she had secured from the city's own digital archives. The police chief sat frozen, realizing that his attempt to shield a rookie had instead opened a window into the systemic rot of his entire command structure. Eleanor's words were sharp, clinical, and undeniable, leaving no room for the excuses or the good faith defenses they had prepared to use against a marginalized citizen. Then, the tone of her voice changed, shifting from the cold clarity of a judge to the fierce protection of a mother as she turned her attention toward the boy. She gestured toward Malik, whose face was now wet with silent tears of relief, and declared that the city's real crime wasn't pulling over a justice, but terrorizing an innocent child. She spoke of the psychological trauma inflicted on a young mind when the very people sworn to protect him become the hunters, using the law as a weapon of fear. "You didn't see a citizen. You saw a target for your own ego," she said, her voice trembling with a controlled, righteous fury that made the city attorney recoil. In that moment, the marble halls of power finally listened to the heartbeat of the streets they had long ignored, through the voice of the woman they had underestimated. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The silence that followed her statement was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the sound of Malik's soft, uneven breathing. The city attorney looked down at his legal pads, his hands shaking as he realized there was no way to spin this disaster or bury the truth. He knew that if this went to a federal court, Eleanor wouldn't just win a settlement. She would dismantle the entire department's funding and reputation with surgical precision. The police chief looked at Officer Klein with a mixture of contempt and terror, realizing the rookie's arrogance had invited a wolf into their fold. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the men who had entered the room as kings were now looking for the nearest exit, their careers flashing before their eyes as they faced the law's ultimate judge. Eleanor stood up, her robes billowing around her like a dark cloud of judgment, and delivered her final, non-negotiable demand to the stunned group across the table. She demanded a $3 million settlement to be paid immediately, alongside the permanent termination of Officer Klein and a comprehensive federal consent decree to oversee the department's training. She made it clear that if they refused, she would not only sue them but would use every ounce of her political influence to ensure a complete overhaul of the leadership. "This isn't a negotiation," she stated, her voice as hard as the granite of the courthouse steps. "This is an opportunity for you to pay for a fraction of the damage you caused." The city attorney nodded slowly, defeated by the very law he had tried to manipulate against the woman he had misjudged. As they walked out of City Hall, the sun was setting over the skyline, casting long golden shadows across the plaza that felt like a quiet benediction. Malik walked beside her, no longer looking at the ground, his shoulders squared and his head held high for the first time in many years. Eleanor felt the weight of her robes, but it was no longer a burden of isolation. It was a cloak of service that she finally understood how to wear. She looked at the boy and realized that while she had spent her life interpreting the law, he had taught her the true meaning of justice through his suffering. The $3 million was just paper and numbers, but the light of newfound hope in Malik's eyes was a victory that no amount of wealth could ever hope to purchase or replace. The victory was swift and absolute, sending a shockwave through the city's political foundations that could be felt from the lowest precincts to the governor's mansion. True to her word, Eleanor did not keep a single cent of the $3 million settlement for herself, viewing the money as a debt owed back to the community she had once unintentionally abandoned. She purchased a historic, once grand building in the heart of Malik's neighborhood, transforming it into a state-of-the-art civil rights legal clinic dedicated to the memory of her father. The building, which once stood as a symbol of urban decay, now gleamed with fresh paint and open glass doors, inviting the vulnerable to seek refuge and representation. It was a concrete change that went beyond judicial opinions, providing a tangible shield for those who had previously been left to face the legal system alone and defenseless. Eleanor's life underwent a radical transformation as she balanced her duties on the Supreme Court with her hands-on involvement at the new legal clinic. She was no longer just a distant name on a legal brief. She became a familiar face in the neighborhood, often seen sharing coffee with local residents or mentoring young law students. Her colleagues in the legal elite watched in a mixture of awe and confusion as she traded some of her gala appearances for Saturday morning workshops on constitutional rights. The ivory tower she had lived in for so long had finally been bridged to the ground, and she found a level of fulfillment that her previous wealth and status had never provided. She realized that her true power lay not in the height of her bench, but in her proximity to the people she was sworn to serve. The rookie officer, Klein, was permanently removed from the force, his name added to a national registry that ensured he would never carry a badge or a gun again. The police department itself was forced to undergo a rigorous, multi-year federal oversight program that fundamentally changed how they interacted with the citizens of the periphery. New training protocols, written with Eleanor's direct input, emphasized de-escalation and constitutional literacy, turning the department from a force of occupation into one of actual community service. The culture of silence and retaliation was replaced by a new standard of accountability, proving that even the most entrenched institutions can be reformed when someone with enough courage is willing to hold the mirror up to their face. The streets felt different, not because the police were gone, but because the fear of them was starting to fade. Malik's life blossomed under the shade of Eleanor's mentorship, as the trauma of his brother's arrest was replaced by a fierce and focused ambition to change the world. With Eleanor's guidance, he secured a full scholarship to a prestigious university, but he never forgot the streets that had initially tried to break his spirit. He spent his summers working at the clinic, helping other young men navigate the complexities of a system that had once seemed designed to swallow them whole. He was no longer the terrified boy with his hands on a dashboard. He was a leader, a scholar, and a living testament to the power of a single act of intervention. Eleanor watched him grow with a pride that was deeper than any professional accolade, knowing she had helped save a brilliant mind from becoming just another statistic. The relationship between the wealthy justice and the neighborhood youth became a beacon of hope for a city that had long been divided by race and class. Their story was shared in classrooms and courtrooms across the country, reminding people that justice is not a static destination but a constant, active pursuit of human connection. Eleanor's father's old sedan remained her primary vehicle, a humble reminder of where she came from and the night that changed everything. Every time she got behind the wheel, she was reminded that the law is only as strong as the people who are willing to stand up for it, especially when it is most difficult. The $3 million had been converted into a legacy of empowerment, proving that when wealth meets empathy, the results are powerful enough to rewrite the future of an entire community. As the years passed, the clinic grew into a national model for community-based legal advocacy, proving that the weight of a gavel can be used to build just as easily as it can be used to punish. Eleanor Hayes had redefined what it meant to be a justice, showing that the highest form of law is the one that protects the smallest of its citizens. The moral of the story remained clear. True justice is not found in the height of the bench you sit on, but in your willingness to stand on the ground with those who have no voice. She had found her voice by listening to the silence of a terrified boy, and in doing so, she had finally found the peace that had eluded her in her years of solitary power. The future was no longer a place of fear, but a landscape of possibility for every child who walked the streets she now called home. Have they made any gesture of kindness that changed a life? Leave a little heart if you believe that love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment, "Love is priceless," if you also believe in human union. 10 years later, the sun streamed through the high windows of the state Supreme Court, illuminating the same marble halls where Eleanor had once felt so isolated. Justice Hayes, now in the twilight of her illustrious career, sat at the center of the bench, her gaze fixed on the podium with a mixture of professional scrutiny and immense personal pride. Standing there, adjusting his glasses and opening a well-worn leather briefcase, was Attorney Malik, ready to present his first case before the state's highest court. He spoke with a clarity and a passion that silenced the room, his arguments rooted in the very principles Eleanor had taught him in her library a decade ago. As he finished his opening statement and looked up at the bench, Eleanor gave him a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent passing of the torch. The cycle of justice had been completed, as a child who was once a victim of the law had now become its most brilliant and dedicated protector.